Have you ever felt judged for something as simple as what you're wearing? Imagine walking into a room and hearing people whisper, laughing, mocking a dress you bought on a budget, assuming it says everything about you. But what if that assumption was completely wrong? What if, hidden inside, there was something that flipped the whole room upside down? Stick around, because the moment they looked closer, everything changed. It wasn't what anyone expected. She had never been one to chase trends or splash out on the latest fashion, not because she didn't care about her appearance, but because she believed in practicality, in choosing pieces that felt comfortable, reliable, and subtly stylish without screaming for attention. Life had taught her early that stability often mattered more than fleeting admiration, and that patience, thrift, and careful planning could make a bigger difference in the long run than splurging on a label. Her wardrobe reflected that philosophy, a mix of secondhand finds, modestly priced items, and the occasional treat when she discovered something unique that felt just right. Each choice carried a sense of quiet confidence, a personal assertion that she didn't need approval from anyone to feel good about herself. She enjoyed fashion as a form of self-expression rather than social currency, valuing the comfort of wearing something that made her feel grounded and authentic, rather than flashy or showy. The day in question started like any other, with a routine she had developed over years of balancing work, errands, and personal time. She had recently found a dress that struck the perfect balance between affordability and elegance, a small victory that made her feel both savvy and stylish. She wore it with a sense of private satisfaction, knowing that it looked just right on her and that it suited the occasion she had in mind. It wasn't brand new, it wasn't screaming designer, but it fit well, felt comfortable, and reflected her understated style. To her, that was enough. To others, it would be something entirely different as soon as she entered the room. The reactions she received were immediate, though subtle at first: quick glances, slightly raised eyebrows, whispered comments that she could catch if she focused. People laughed softly, mocked the cheapness of the fabric, and made assumptions about her life, her income, her taste, none of which had any bearing on the reality of who she was. It stung more than she expected, not because she lacked confidence in herself, but because she had thought that people who knew her, or even strangers willing to behave politely, would keep their judgments to themselves. She had faced criticism before, but there was something about the combination of ridicule and ignorance that felt particularly dismissive, a shallow interpretation of something as trivial as a dress that somehow became a reflection of her character in the eyes of others. Her inner voice, calm and measured, reminded her not to overreact, to observe rather than retaliate immediately. She had learned through past experiences that people often reveal more about themselves than they do about you, that hasty confrontations rarely achieve anything productive, and that patience could transform even an uncomfortable situation into an opportunity for clarity and control. She moved with deliberate composure, adjusting her posture slightly, keeping her expression neutral yet self-assured, as if quietly signaling that she was aware of the whispers but entirely unshaken by them. It was a small but deliberate assertion of presence, the kind of subtle body language that commanded attention without demanding confrontation. At the same time, she couldn't help noticing the social dynamics around her: the clusters of people laughing together, comparing outfits, and making snap judgments. Some were obviously trying to elevate themselves by putting others down, while others simply followed the lead of those in the group, hesitant to form opinions of their own. It was a familiar scene, yet it had a sting today that made her more aware than usual of how much assumptions could obscure reality. And yet, there was an underlying amusement too. She recognized that the moment had potential, that, in a situation where others thought they held all the power, the tiniest detail could completely flip the perception, that the smallest truth revealed in the right moment could undo a room full of shallow assumptions. Her attention drifted to the dress itself, the small label inside that she had barely thought about when buying it. It was not flashy, not obvious to anyone without close inspection, yet it represented something far more valuable than just a name: craftsmanship, reputation, and a story that others would immediately recognize once they looked closely. She smiled quietly to herself, the realization forming that the judgmental eyes around her were about to encounter an entirely different reality than they had assumed. It wasn't about bragging or proving a point. It was about quietly asserting that appearances, while often misleading, could be leveraged subtly to reveal truth without creating unnecessary conflict. Even as the whispers and side glances continued, she felt a growing sense of control, a light but clear satisfaction that the small details she had carefully considered would soon shift the room's energy. She thought about previous situations where she had been underestimated, moments where patience and observation had allowed her to reveal her capabilities in unexpected ways. Those experiences had taught her that timing and subtlety often carried far more impact than immediate reactions or overt displays, that the most powerful moments were frequently the ones that seemed unremarkable until the right eyes saw the truth. Her friends, some of whom had accompanied her, were largely unaware of the undercurrent of judgment, laughing or chatting casually. Yet even they noticed a change in her demeanor, quiet confidence that radiated in small gestures, in the way she held her head, in the calm manner in which she adjusted her stance. She did not need anyone to validate her, yet she was aware that the forthcoming revelation would speak volumes to those who had assumed they could measure her worth by superficial observation alone. There was anticipation, yes, but not arrogance, a measured acknowledgement that people often see only what they expect, and that the smallest, most inconspicuous detail could overturn assumptions entirely. By the time she reached the center of the room, she had noticed a few more subtle shifts. People turning slightly, eyes darting toward her as if sensing that the initial assumptions might not tell the full story. She moved with casual grace, deliberately showing nothing but a composed, natural presence. The dress, while modest and affordable, now carried an invisible weight of impending revelation, a quiet potential to disrupt shallow judgments without any need for dramatics. It was a small, almost private victory, one that she anticipated with calm amusement rather than any desire to humiliate. Even before anyone noticed the label, the scene had shifted subtly. The body language, the posture, and the awareness she projected had begun to unsettle the assumptions others held. It was remarkable, she thought, how much people rely on immediate perception, and how easily those perceptions could be appended by a small, carefully placed detail. She didn't need to announce anything, didn't need to call attention to herself overtly. The label would do the talking, and the room would recalibrate naturally once it was seen. It was a quiet power, a small but precise control over perception, and she savored the anticipation of seeing it unfold, knowing that the result would be more effective than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. And as the moment approached, she reflected briefly on why she had developed this patience and attention to detail over the years. Life had taught her that reactions driven by ego or defensiveness rarely produced meaningful outcomes, that observation, strategy, and calm confidence often created results that were both satisfying and instructive. The label inside the dress, the small victory she carried almost invisibly, represented that philosophy in action. A simple truth that would disrupt assumptions, highlight oversight, and quietly reveal reality to those who had assumed otherwise. In that calm, almost meditative anticipation, she felt a rare combination of amusement and satisfaction, aware that in a matter of moments, the room would realize the mismatch between expectation and reality, and she would do so without needing to raise her voice or justify herself. As the room continued to buzz with chatter and subtle laughter, she felt a shift in the energy, though it was nearly imperceptible at first. People were adjusting their attention, glances darting toward her more frequently, whispering now with a slightly different tone, a quiet curiosity mingling with judgment. It was fascinating, watching how quickly assumptions could wobble once the smallest detail threatened to contradict them. The label inside her dress, which had been completely invisible from a distance, carried a significance that those around her were entirely unprepared to comprehend. She felt a mix of amusement and calm satisfaction, knowing that the next moments would be telling, revealing both the superficiality of first impressions and the subtle power of observation. She moved carefully, maintaining her composure, aware of the room's shifting awareness but revealing nothing in her expression. Each step, each adjustment of posture, was measured, part of a subtle performance that balanced natural confidence with complete restraint. There was no need to overplay. The dynamic was already tilting in her favor. She noticed the colleague standing nearby, the one who had initially joined in the mocking whispers, shifting uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward her, as though sensing that something had changed. The realization began to dawn in small increments. The room's reaction was about to be recalibrated by a truth they hadn't anticipated. She glanced down momentarily, adjusting the hem slightly, drawing attention just enough for anyone looking closely to notice the label. It wasn't an exaggeration, a flashy brand, or something designed to provoke envy. It was a mark of craftsmanship, an emblem of subtle prestige that only someone attuned to quality would recognize. Yet that was all it took. The ripple began almost imperceptibly at first, small movements of heads, a pause in conversation, brief hesitation as people's brains worked to reconcile the initial assumptions with the new information. The mocking whispers faltered, replaced by a quiet reassessment. Some eyes widened, some lips parted in surprise, while others tried to mask their astonishment, shifting uncomfortably as reality forced them to reconsider their initial judgments. The colleague who had laughed first seemed to struggle the most. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a slight tension that betrayed the cognitive dissonance she felt. How could someone she had immediately dismissed as cheap now carry something that contradicted her assumptions so completely? It was an uncomfortable realization, a quiet but unmistakable shock. And watching it unfold was both satisfying and subtly instructive. She wasn't seeking revenge through humiliation. She was demonstrating the natural consequences of snap judgments and superficial evaluations, and in that moment, she realized how easily the dynamics of perception could be manipulated through patience, observation, and an almost imperceptible use of detail. As the attention shifted more fully, she began to notice the subtle strategies people employed when faced with unexpected information. Some diverted their gaze, unwilling to openly acknowledge their error. Others whispered to neighbors, attempting to make sense of the discrepancy. A few simply stared, caught between curiosity and embarrassment. It was a microcosm of human behavior, the interplay of ego, expectation, and surprise. And she watched it quietly, analyzing without judgment, fully aware that the label inside the dress had done all the work. She realized then that sometimes the most powerful interventions required no confrontation at all, just the careful placement of truth in a context where assumptions were already fragile. There was a rhythm to the unfolding scene, a quiet escalation of tension and recalibration that played out over several minutes. She moved subtly through the room, engaging in light conversation with acquaintances while letting the label remain visible enough to be noticed, but never drawing attention to herself overtly. It was a delicate balance, a dance between invisibility and revelation, and it required a nuanced understanding of human perception. The small adjustments she made, tilting her wrists, bending slightly to reach for something, were deliberate, engineered to catch eyes without seeming intentional. The room continued to adjust, the earlier mocking energy replaced by a mix of respect, curiosity, and subtle awe. She could see the ripple effect extend beyond the immediate cluster of people. Those who hadn't noticed the initial reaction were now catching up, sensing that something significant had shifted in the social landscape of the room. Conversations stalled as observers processed the information, social hierarchies subtly reconfiguring in real time as assumptions were challenged. The colleagues' discomfort grew with each passing moment, a quiet tension manifesting in minor fidgeting, crossed arms, and involuntary glances toward her. She remained poised, calm, and composed, aware that this natural, understated display of truth was far more effective than any overt confrontation could have been. It was fascinating to witness how quickly perceptions could alter behavior. She reflected briefly on past experiences, on other times when assumptions had misrepresented her capabilities or intentions, and recognized a pattern. People often underestimate what they don't immediately understand, and yet, those very moments of misjudgment contained the seeds of influence, opportunities to subtly shift awareness and correct misconceptions without the need for conflict. In this case, the label inside her dress had acted as that seed, quietly reshaping the social dynamics in a manner that was inevitable once noticed. The climax of the scene emerged gradually but unmistakably. The colleague who had mocked her initially became visibly unsettled, exchanging awkward glances with others, their confidence faltering under the quiet scrutiny that the label had triggered. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It was a slow, natural unraveling of assumption, a subtle but undeniable shift in power dynamics. The room, which had moments before been filled with whispers of judgment, now carried an undercurrent of realization, respect, and mild astonishment. She observed it all with calm satisfaction, knowing that the scenario had unfolded organically, that no forced gestures were necessary to underscore the truth. At one point, someone asked a question about where she had found the dress, genuinely curious, and the conversation shifted entirely. The mocking energy dissipated as attention turned toward the quality and craftsmanship. toward the reality behind the initial impression. She answered casually, as if the moment were ordinary, knowing full well the contrast between their assumptions and reality would linger in their minds. The subtle irony of the situation was not lost on her. The laughter that had once cut so sharply was now replaced by acknowledgement and reconsideration. The social misjudgment corrected without overt drama. Through it all, she remained conscious of her own reactions, lightly amused, confident, yet entirely composed. There was no triumphalism, no desire to humiliate. The satisfaction lay in the quiet correction of false impressions, in the demonstration that truth, even when understated, has a natural potency that can't be ignored. She reflected on the lesson inherent in the unfolding events. The world often measures worth superficially, but even the smallest details can carry enormous weight when revealed at the right moment. Timing, observation, and subtlety were powerful tools, more effective than confrontation or dramatics in revealing reality. As the scene reached its peak, the colleagues' discomfort became unmistakable, a natural reaction to the discrepancy between expectation and reality. Others around them began to acknowledge the shift in unspoken terms, adjusting their posture, moderating their tone, and reconsidering prior judgments. The atmosphere in the room had changed subtly, but undeniably. The earlier tension replaced by a recognition of competence, taste, and the quiet power of understated detail. She had orchestrated nothing overtly, yet the outcome reflected her influence entirely, the label inside her dress acting as a silent agent of revelation. Finally, she allowed herself a small smile, the satisfaction internal rather than external, knowing that the moment had been resolved perfectly. The social balance had shifted without confrontation, judgment had been corrected without drama, and the assumptions that had led to ridicule were now quietly undone. The ripple effect continued as conversations drifted to neutral topics, leaving behind only the subtle memory of the lesson. Appearances can deceive, assumptions can mislead, and the smallest truths, revealed with timing and poise, carry the most impact. She moved through the remainder of the event with the same composure, aware that her presence now commanded a quiet respect she hadn't explicitly sought, a recognition of skill in observation and the measured presentation of truth. The colleague, still adjusting to the realization, maintained their distance, subtly changed in posture and tone, and the room's dynamics had been irreversibly altered by the understated revelation. It was the kind of climax that didn't explode dramatically, but rather unfolded with an almost imperceptible inevitability, the culmination of patience, awareness, and subtle action, leaving everyone involved with a deep, unspoken understanding of what had just transpired. After the initial revelation in the room, she didn't rush to celebrate or make any show of her small triumph. She understood that true influence often works quietly, like a subtle undercurrent that shifts everything around it without drawing attention to itself. The incident with the dress had altered perceptions, but she knew that lasting change, both in how people viewed her and in the confidence she carried, required more than a single moment of validation. It required thoughtful observation, strategic action, and the ability to navigate future interactions with the same subtle control she had exercised today. She spent the following days reflecting on the event, replaying the scene in her mind not with amusement alone but with a careful analysis of human behavior. She considered how assumptions had shaped reactions, how judgment could be both swift and fragile, and how small details could carry disproportionate weight when revealed at the right moment. Each observation reinforced her understanding that patience and subtlety often produced outcomes far more powerful than immediate confrontation. She began to see opportunities in daily interactions that others might overlook, the small gestures, the unnoticed details, the moments when perception could be gently guided to reveal truth. While the dress incident had been a small-scale revelation, it gave her a larger sense of agency in her social and professional environment. She started to apply the same careful attention to her work, her relationships, and her presence in spaces where superficial judgments were common. She realized that by observing patterns of behavior and leveraging subtle cues, she could influence outcomes, correct misperceptions, and assert her competence without overtly asserting herself. It was not about manipulation, she told herself, but about balance, aligning reality with perception in a way that was fair, understated, and quietly effective. The colleague who had initially mocked her began to act differently around her, unconsciously moderating behavior, adjusting posture, and choosing words with more care. It was clear that the initial reaction had left an impression, a subtle awareness that their assumptions were no longer reliable. She noticed it in small gestures, a hesitant glance, a pause before speaking, a slight shift in tone. These were not dramatic or intentional signals, but natural consequences of the previous event. Observing them, she felt a quiet satisfaction, understanding that influence did not always require confrontation. It could be exerted through presence, awareness, and timing. She also noticed changes in the wider group dynamic. People who had once assumed they could judge her superficially were now more cautious, more attentive to nuance, and more willing to consider context before forming opinions. The atmosphere, once filled with shallow laughter and judgment, had shifted towards subtle respect, curiosity, and acknowledgement. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual, natural recalibration that reflected the power of a well-timed revelation and the influence of careful composure. As the weeks passed, she continued to cultivate this approach. In professional settings, she paid attention to overlooked details, anticipating issues before they arose and subtly guiding conversations and decisions with insight rather than authority. In social settings, she maintained awareness of the small cues that indicated assumptions or judgments, choosing moments to reveal truth in ways that were natural, understated, and effective. Each success reinforced her belief in the quiet potency of observation and timing, a skill that she had honed over time, and which now carried significant influence without ever appearing forceful or confrontational. One afternoon, a larger opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. A project she had been involved with, though not in a leading role, required careful oversight to prevent errors that could have been costly for the team. She recognized immediately where assumptions and superficial judgments had led others to overlook crucial details. Applying the same careful, unobtrusive strategy she had used with the dress incident, she made subtle adjustments, reviewing processes, gently correcting oversights, and providing guidance in ways that appeared collaborative rather than directive. The project began to stabilize. Errors were corrected without drawing attention to her interventions, and the final results exceeded expectations. Her colleagues, including the one who had mocked her earlier, noticed the improvement. Though they struggled to attribute it to any one individual, the natural consequence of her careful attention was now visible in outcomes rather than appearances, reinforcing the lesson that influence and competence often operate behind the scenes, unseen until results manifest. She felt a quiet pride, not in recognition, but in the knowledge that her deliberate, thoughtful approach had created a tangible difference, and that those who had underestimated her were now seeing the reality of her abilities unfold organically. Yet even as she achieved these subtle victories, she remained aware of the delicate balance between influence and humility. She had learned that demonstrating competence was not the same as seeking domination, that correcting assumptions did not require condescension, and that patience often outweighed immediacy. Her satisfaction came from understanding the impact of her actions, the way they quietly shaped perception and reality, and the natural unfolding of consequences rather than any overt display of triumph. The colleague who had initially mocked her eventually approached with a mixture of hesitation and acknowledgement, a small gesture of recognition that seemed sincere yet unforced. Their interaction was brief, marked by a natural exchange of polite civility rather than dramatics or apology. She responded with composed neutrality, aware that the prior incident had spoken more effectively than words ever could. In that moment, she recognized the subtlety of resolution. Influence, understanding, and the quiet assertion of reality often carried far more weight than confrontation, and the experience had taught her the enduring value of patience, observation, and strategic subtlety. Reflecting further, she realized that the lessons extended beyond social dynamics. They applied to personal development, professional growth, and the way she approached challenges in all areas of life. She had discovered that power and agency were not always loud or overt, that true effectiveness often relied on subtlety, timing, and careful attention to context. The dress incident had been a catalyst, a microcosm of the larger principle. Small truths, revealed strategically, can reshape perceptions and outcomes far more profoundly than immediate reactions or dramatic displays. Even in her personal life, she found herself applying these insights, choosing moments to act, speak, or reveal information with careful consideration of timing and impact. She cultivated awareness of her surroundings, of others' assumptions, and of the subtle levers that could shift perception and outcome without confrontation. Her confidence was quiet but steadfast, rooted not in ego or validation but in understanding, foresight, and the ability to influence naturally. It was a skill that extended beyond social interactions, shaping decisions, responses, and strategies in a measured, deliberate manner. Ultimately, the experience left her with a renewed sense of agency and perspective. She understood that life often measures people superficially, that assumptions are frequently misleading, and that influence could be exerted most effectively through patience, observation, and timing rather than overt force. The small label inside her dress had been a catalyst, a demonstration of this principle, and the events that followed reinforced the enduring lesson. Subtlety, insight, and strategic action often yield the most profound and satisfying outcomes. And, in the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, realizing that the initial mockery had transformed into an opportunity not just to correct perceptions, but to exercise a refined, natural influence that extended across social and professional spheres. She had revealed reality without spectacle, adjusted assumptions without confrontation, and affirmed her capabilities without needing validation. The result was a subtle but undeniable recalibration of perception and respect, a shift that carried more weight than any dramatized victory could have produced. The twist, unspoken but unmistakable, was that in asserting herself quietly, she had gained far more than social recognition. She had developed a framework for understanding human behavior, influencing outcomes, and navigating assumptions with skill and precision. Her satisfaction was internal, nuanced, and enduring, a testament to the power of observation, patience, and subtle action. No one else had to acknowledge her triumph for it to matter. The outcome, and the quiet mastery she exercised over the situation, was proof enough. By the end of the experience, she had emerged not only vindicated but empowered, aware of her ability to navigate complex social dynamics with grace, intelligence, and subtle effectiveness. The room, once filled with whispers and judgment, had shifted into an environment of measured acknowledgement, curiosity, and respect, all achieved without conflict, drama, or overt assertion. It was a quiet victory, a lesson in the power of small truths and thoughtful action, and a reminder that sometimes the most profound change occurs not through confrontation, but through observation, patience, and the strategic revelation of reality.